I'm Tony, and today we're going to learn how to make a weighted blanket. Weighted blankets are something that started a few years ago, and there's a lot of benefits to them. It basically is a heavier type blanket that pushes down on you, that gives you a sense of comfort. There's lots of reasons that you may want to have or gift a weighted blanket. If someone has anxiety, if they are autistic, if they're on the spectrum at all, there's lots of benefits. Now, there's some people that don't like them at all. So I always suggest try to go a little bit smaller, see if you like it before spending a lot of time and effort into making a large weighted blanket. Weighted blankets are made up of 4 things. First is the top fabric. I'm going to be using a panel to make it easier. This is in a really cool Stonehenge panel by Northcott. It's a little bit thinner than a regular panel, so it's not going to take me as much time or effort to make it. So I can easily show you how this weighted blanket's going to be. So there's my top. You also need a backing. I am using a coordinating Stonehenge fabric in the solstice. I apologize. The solstice line. So it's going to be a Stonehenge solstice fabric that I'm going to use as a coordinating for the back. You also need poly beads. Poly beads are just little plastic beads. You can find them in toys, in stuffies. So we're going to be using these beads. In fact, I have a big old box of them right here, of the lovely poly beads, and they're getting everywhere. You also need a stuffing. You can use Polyfil. I am actually going to be using some old pillows that I am no longer using anymore. I've opened up the pillows, and I'm going to be using the pillow stuffing out of those pillows. So 4 things: a front fabric, a back fabric, poly beads, and Polyfil or pillow stuffing. Links to some of the things are down below. And of course your sewing machine. You need a sewing machine, needle, thread, and that's it. So they're actually pretty simple to make. It is a matter of taking the time and effort to do it. They're simple in theory, but whenever they start getting heavy, it's a little hard to maneuver it, which is why I say make a small one first, make sure you like it, make sure it's good, and then you can think about making a large one. Now, the most important question to ask is, how heavy should your weighted blanket be? The general consensus from health professionals is 10% of your body weight. If you are an adult, 10% plus a few pounds, plus about 1 to 2 pounds additional. So if you have a child that is 100 pounds, your weighted blanket should be 10 pounds, just to give that added extra pressure. So keep that in mind as we're going through and I'm showing you all the steps. We'll talk about the weight, we'll talk about how to figure out the beads, things like that. So let's get started and start making our weighted blanket. The first thing we want to do is make sure that our fabrics for our top and our bottom are the same size. So in this case, because I'm using a panel, I'm going to trim all the way around. You notice I've already done the other 3 sides. I'm going to trim all the way around, and so I have a 1/4 inch that I can see. And then I'm going to sew together the top and the bottom. Now, if your top or your front or your back are a pieced quilt, that is not a problem. Just make sure that your front and your back of your weighted blanket are the same exact size. And that is extremely important, that they're the same exact size. So what I'm going to do in this case is, now that I've trimmed up my front, I'm going to measure and see how long, with the 1/4 inch seam allowances, because we're doing this with a 1/4 inch seam. Let's see, this is exactly 42 inches. So I'm going to take my backing fabric, and my backing fabric is 44 inches. So I'm going to trim this 42 inches, And then after trimming 42 inches, they are going to be ready to go for sewing. Now, before we can sew it, what we want to do is we want to prepare the top. And this is important. So what is a weighted blanket? A weighted blanket is a design. It's basically like I said, two things of fabric, the beads and the stuffing. Now, it is important whenever we put the beads and the stuffing in, you don't just throw it all in there, or else it's going to group up into one area. We want to make sure that it is situated the same throughout. And how we're going to do that is we're going to sew it in sections. So we're going to sew together the top and the back on the left, on the right, and on the bottom, not the top. The top we're going to leave open. And that's because we're going to be putting in beads and stuffing one row at a time. All right, so we're going to be doing a row at a time. Now, you want to make sure that your rows are about 5 to 8 inches, and then your sections are 5 to 8 inches, okay? Now, that's important because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing our columns, sliding them in, and then doing our rows. So we want to make sure that these are evenly spaced. So I'm looking for my design to my design. So taking off my 1/4 inch seams, my top is 28 inches wide. So I want to divide these by 28 inches wide. And then remember I said that this was, my design should be about 42 inches. Yes, my design's about, oh, you know what? I thought this was 42 inches. It's a good thing I didn't cut my backing fabric again. It's actually 43 inches. See, because I've got another little ½ inch on there. So it's 43 inches long because without the, I'm sorry, 42.5. I cannot math today. It is 42.5 inches long because the design itself is 42. So doing the math, 42 inches long, and then, what did I say, 28 inches wide? So I need to think about what number goes evenly into both 42 and 28. So going 28 inches wide, you know what? I think I'm going to go, let's see, 28. Oh, divides by 7 evenly. So I'm going to do that. Remember I said between 5 and 8 inches? So I'm going to go 7 inches. So we're going to split these up into different 7-inch wide ones. And I'm going to draw lines straight up and down every 4 inches. Now, I've got a couple of different options for this. I can use my chalk roller. I can use my pencils. I can use chalk. I can use whatever I like. I'm personally going to use some chalk. So I'm going to draw my vertical lines, and then I'm going to come back and show you. Now you can see my lines here. I've split it up into 4 7-inch groups. Obviously, if it's a wider weighted blanket that you're making, it's going to have more rows. Just make sure that these chunks are between 5 and 8 inches. Now it's time to draw this side. I said that this was 42 inches wide. Well, you know what? 42 also divides by 7. So I'm going to do 7-inch chunks going this way, and I'll have 6 of them. So I'm going to use my straight edge and line it up, and use my chalk and draw 7-inch strips going this way, and then I'll come back and show you the finished one. Alright, as you can see, I have all of my grids set up and ready to go. Now, it's really important that we do this before we do any sewing, because it's going to be really, really hard to draw these lines on after you do the next few sewing steps. So, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sew around the edges, leaving the top open. Do not sew the top. Now, how I'm going to do this is with a French seam. So I'm going to first sew the wrong side to the wrong, wrong side to wrong side. So this is the wrong side to the wrong side. So just like you're going to take a look at it, for the finished product, we are going to do that. So wrong side to wrong side. Now, as you line this up here along the edge, you'll notice that the really cool thing about the wrong side to wrong side with the French seam is I'm going to actually sew it just on the inside here of my 1/4 inch seam. So I'm not going to worry about being a perfect 1/4 inch seam. I'm just going to follow right along here along the edge of my panel quilt. So I'm going to sew these 3 edges and then come back and show you the next step. Okay, so I have the everything sewn. All I did was follow right along here. And now we have 2 options at this point. If you are doing if you're doing binding, so if you're adding binding to the end when you're finished with your weighted blanket, you can actually, you don't have to flip and do a French seam. If you trim this, now we're going to trim this either way, whether it's a French seam or you're leaving this, but, all right, let's do that. So we're going to trim along the edge, and how we're going to trim this is we're going to trim it to about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around where I sewed. Now remember, the top is open, so I did not sew the top, just the 2 sides and the bottom. Now, after I trim it, now I have 2 options. I can leave this alone, skip the next step, skip to where in the time codes we're doing our vertical sewing. You're just going to vertical sew it up, so skip to that one. Or if you want to do a French seam, go ahead and keep watching with the next steps. Now, benefits to both of them. I'm going to do a binding. Even with a French seam, I'm doing a binding because this right here is going to be a little messy when I close it, so I want to clean that up a bit with that binding. But if you definitely are doing a binding and you don't want to do that French seam, you could stop right here. But I'm going to show you the entire steps, so I am going to go through and finish that French seam. So either way, now if you are not doing any binding, you have to do the French seam method. That's the best way to do it. Now, binding, you can do 2 different kinds of binding. You can do the double fold binding and just clip it in, or you can do quilt binding. So I'll talk about that more at the end after we have this whole thing stuffed. So let's go ahead and trim this, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you the next step for the French seam. Now, I have a full tutorial for the French seam listed down below, so I'm going to just skim over this a little bit. If you don't know how to do a French seam, please take a look at the video down below of how to do that. So, next step, of course, we are flipping this inside out, and I'm going to iron these 3 seams. So I'm going to iron these 3 seams out, and then I'm going to take these over to my sewing machine and sew these down, and then I'm going to flip it the other way and sew it the other way so that we have a beautiful French seam on there, and then I will come back and show you the next step. Now, if you decide not to do any binding, the French seam gives it a wonderful, pretty look to make sure that it's in there. Now, if you decide that you just want to do a regular seam, right side to right side, flip it inside out, that's fine. It's just the French seam gives it a nice finished, even on the inside, with no chance of any open seams coming out. So now we've got our seam finished. It's time to do our verticals. So at this point, now here's where you may decide that you may want to do some binding, because you're going to have to go start from your edge and go all the way up. So start from the bottom. You're going to have to actually secure this in there, especially if it's going to be an open seam. Go back and forth, securing it, and then sewing straight up all the way to the very top. Now, when you get to the very top, whenever you're sewing this, you want to stop about 2 inches from the end. Okay? Do not sew all the way to the end. Stop about 2 inches, go back and forth, and then forward. Now, thread choices. Whenever you're doing your verticals, remember you are going to see this thread. So in my case, I may do a gold, I may do a green. I haven't decided yet. I'm actually going to go pick the thread right now. You could even use invisible thread. If you decide to use invisible thread, it is a plastic thread. Keep that in mind. You can never have heat on this. Now, you may not want to have heat anyways because the poly pellets are also plastic. So so whenever you do this, never put it in the dryer, ever, 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 because you don't want to melt these little plastic beads. So you could use the invisible thread for that. In fact, I may even use invisible thread. I'm going to think about this. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to sew every single one of my verticals. So all 3 here. You do not need to sew your ends, just your center verticals, stopping about 2 inches from the end, and then I'll come back and we'll discover together what thread I decided to use for mine. Surprise! I decided to use gold thread. So the more I thought about it, I wanted to be able to show you how some thread can blend into your design and then stand out on other parts. So, and then on the back, it blends right in and it looks really nice. So whatever thread you decide to do, make sure, let me show you the bottoms. You want to make sure that you lock in these edges right here. Make sure that those are locked in. And then this is nice and clean. I may decide not to put a binding at all on this. This turned out really, really well for me. So however I finish off my top, if I can get that looking just as nice, then I will make sure that, that I actually don't need a binding, that it's perfectly fine. All right, so now comes the weighted part of it. We have our columns done. What we're going to be doing is taking our beads, opening up our quilt, and dropping the beads into, opening up the blanket and dropping the beads into there. Now, how you figure out how many beads to work with. Remember I said that your weighted blanket should be about 10% of the body weight of the person you're making this for. So in my case, this is a smaller lap blanket, so I'm going to say that this is for a smaller person, let's say 80 pounds. Okay, so an 80-pound person. So we have 80 pounds. Now, we have 16 ounces in a pound, so I'm going to multiply that by 16. Now, if you are on the metric system, you can do the conversions depending upon the system that you're on. So in this case, we have 1,280 ounces that this needs to be. Now, we have how many blocks? At this point, decide how many blocks you have in, so each one that we have with our chalk line and with our thread line, we're going to do the calculations. I have 24 blocks. So I'm going to take the 1,280 ounces, divide that by 24 blocks. Each block should be about 53 ounces. So I have already measured my 1/3 cup full of poly beads. Let me see if I can, there we go. So these are the poly beads. I have links down below. It's going to give that texture and that weight at the same time. So this is about 20 ounces. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to take my 1/3 of a cup and I'm going to open this up here and I'm just going to take my 1/3 of a cup and dump it in. So there's one, and it's about this is a little bit less than full. There's 2, and let's do a 3rd one. So this is probably about 3/4 of the way full. So that should be about 53 to 55 ounces. And I'm going to do that now for each of my 4. Oh, the conversions of how much you need are down below in the comments. So if you're like, Tony, wait, what was that? How do I figure out my weight of what I want to do? Just look down below in the description of this video, and I have them all there. There's 1, there's 2, and then a half, and then 1 more. We've got 1, 2, and a half. All right, so we've got them all in there. So now I'm going to take my weighted blanket and I'm going to pick the whole thing up and get every single one of those beads down into the bottom. So my beads are now all right here. You can hear them, and I can feel them. They're all on the bottom. Now, at this point, you have a decision to make. So I have all of my beads right here in these 4 pockets. Now, do I want the textile of being able to fidget and play with these beads? Or is this the actual movement of the beads and feeling them, is this going to bother me? If this is going to bother you, or if you want additional puffiness to your quilt, at this point, that is when you use either the stuffing of pillows or you use the Polyfil. I have some Polyfil linked down below. So if you decide that, yes, you know what, I don't want these beads, I want a little puffiness, I want more texture and more inside my actual quilt, that's when you put that Polyfil in. Now, I will warn you, it is harder to work with the Polyfil in there. I have made quite a few weighted blankets, and in my personal opinion, for me, I have problems working with this with that Polyfil in there. So what I do is I just work within the beads. So at this point, I am now going to take the rest of this and I'm going to roll it up, and I'm just rolling down the river. All right, so roll, 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 roll. Now, the reason why I'm rolling this is I don't want to take the chance of having these beads come back up into, oops, and right here, I feel a bead. So this is what you're doing. You're making sure there's no beads caught anywhere else. So make sure that you shake it down. So shake it. Make sure that all those beads get all the way down and feel it, because you don't want to catch any beads up in there. See, there's a bead right there. So just push it down, all the way down until you can't feel any other beads. Then, when the beads are all definitely down there, roll this up so it's easier to deal with. Because if you're, this is why I said do a smaller quilt, smaller blanket. Sorry, I'm used to saying quilts. Do a smaller blanket before moving on to bigger ones, so you have that technique down. So we're pushing all these down. Now, if you have the Polyfil, like I said, your Polyfil should be in here as well at this point. Just getting all these beads down. Now, you have 2 choices. You can either work with this and just sew straight across just like it is, or something I have seen other people do is they actually take pins. Sorry, there's a bead right there that's annoying me. I'm going to push down. There it is. They take pins and they put pins straight down. And what this does is it holds the front and the back fabric in place so it's not going to slide. If you have Polyfil in there, you may really need to do this. Now, don't forget, whenever you're sewing, please remove your pins. Do not sew over your pins. It is a horrible habit. You can damage your machine. You can cause issues. Just don't do it. So we're moving this down all the way. And there. So we've got that. Now, what I'm going to be doing is the same exact thing I did right here, where I'm going to start sewing right here. I'm going to lock in my stitches, go back and forth a few times, and then follow this line and go straight across, and then lock in my stitches a few times right there. Okay, and then so I'm going to go ahead and sew that, and then I will come back and show it to you, and we'll keep working down the line and do the next step. Our first row is done. So as you can hear, I have the beads in here. Oh yeah, and they're good. And they're not going to leave beyond here. Now, if you think that this is too much space for those beads to move around, remember you can make these squares smaller. Mine are 7 inches by 7 inches. No, 6. Yeah, they're about 6.5 to 7 inches wide. About 6.5 by 7 inches tall. And of course, remember, I don't have any of the polyfill in here at all. It's just beads. Now, there are some people that think the single stitching isn't enough. If you want to play it safe and you want to go back and stitch it a second time, by all means, stitch it a second time. That's not a problem. Things to keep in mind as you're doing this. Do not sew the beads. Do not sew anywhere near the beads. So my tactic of how I do this is I take this and I push all the beads down into one big puff, and then I sew it. Now, if you have polyfill in here, same thing. Get it away from where you're sewing this. You do not want to sew anywhere near that polyfill or the poly beads. All right, so now it's just a matter of rinse and repeat. So we're going to open this up, and I'm going to take my beads, and I'm going to put the same amount. So there's 1, there is 2, and a half. So I'm going to do that for each of these 4 columns again, and I'm going to shake this out and get it all the way down. And oops, one of my beads fell out. Let's put that bead back in there. There we go. Shake it all the way down. There we are. And then now I have that second row of beads. So we've got that there. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do all of the beads in this entire quilt all the way down until I get to the top. Because when I get to the top, that is whenever we have to do something else. So let's go ahead and finish all of these beads, and then I'm going to stop one from the top, just like what I just said, and I'm going to come back and show you how to close off and finish your weighted blanket. Okay, now we need to figure out how to close this top. We've got all of our beads sewn in to all of these rows in our lovely pockets. So let's take a look at the top. Now, you could do this step ahead of time towards the beginning of the weighted blanket. I personally don't like doing it towards the beginning because whenever I pour the beads in, I tend to pull it all out. So what we want to do is we want to take our corners and we want to fold them in about a 1/4 inch. Now, if you go as far as a 1/2 inch, that is totally fine. So take your ends, fold them in, and then what you're going to do is take this over to the ironing board or bring the ironing board to you and fold these in just like that. And then iron it down and make sure that you iron these in place. Okay, I have my wool mat and my Liso iron, so I've already started that. So let's iron that. Now you notice as I'm ironing it, I try to make them even, or I'll make the bottom just a little bit shorter and have the top hang. And then that way you don't see the backing come through. And just like that. So folding them under and then ironing them down. And you want to do this all the way to the end, making sure that it's at least a 1/4 inch seam up to a 1/2 inch seam. Now that we have this ironed and folded in, what we want to do is finish off these vertical lines. So you can actually at this point now start where you finish this off and finish these all the way down. So come down and sew all the way to the very end, finishing this off, and then come back to add the poly beads. Now don't forget, you want to make sure you lock in your threads at the beginning and the end of where you're sewing here. You do not want this to be able to open up. So now what we want to do is let's put our last poly beads, and if you're using polyfill, inside. So we're going to fill these pockets up. So let me do that. So there's 1, 2, 3, and you'll see what I mean about catching the ends here and having those issues. I just like doing it now because then that way you have much cleaner iron lines and you don't have to worry about going back and redoing it. 1, 2 and a half. Whoops, I just spilled beads everywhere. Now, this is the most awkward one, the last one, because it's heavy. You've been making this blanket super heavy, and it is at the very end. 3. And 1. This is my last one. Really? You don't say, Granite. And 2. Whoops, I just missed it again. Let me collect all of these. I tend to make a mess when it comes to the last pockets. And a half. Okay, so we've got those. Now, here is the trick, is getting this closed without having any issues. So what I like to do is either use Wonder Clips or pins. So I'm actually going to turn this around this way because I'm going to feed this into my machine. So this is going to be my throat of my machine on this side. So this is all going to go to the left of it. If you try to put what you've already done into the throat of your machine, then you're going to have some issues and it's not going to fit. So you definitely want to work one row at a time. And like I said, I like to put the weight of it towards the left of my machine. All right, so after I finish pinning this, at this point, I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm going to sew along the edge right here to seal this. But then you're going to see that thread right there unless you're using invisible thread. So to make it nice and even, I'm going to turn it and then sew all the way around the edge. Now remember what I said, you do not want to include any of the beads. So pull your beads away from the edge and slowly sew all the way around. So you're going to make a picture frame with your thread all the way around to close it. And after we do that, I'll bring it back and show you, and we'll talk binding, optional binding. And this is it. So at this point, my entire blanket is finished with all of my beads in there. And as you see, it's not really too puffy because I didn't put any polyfill in it. Now, you have 2 choices at this point. The first choice is, do you want binding? And the second choice is, do you want to put a label on it, your lovely little label? So binding. With binding, now, like I said, if you did the French seam and you closed it off like this is fine. You may be finished. In fact, I've decided I love the way that this looks. I'm not putting binding on mine. But if you want to put binding, both the double fold binding, where you can just kind of put it on here and sew along, will work, or the quilter's binding, where you sew it onto the front, flip it to the back, and then sew it in place. I do have a video on how to do quilt binding, so that video is down below. If I decide to make a video on the double fold binding, I will include that video as well. So this is the... that is your quilt. So if you put binding on it, great. If not, well, then this is finished. And that is how you do a weighted blanket. Man, this thing has got some good heft to it. As you can see, the beads kind of sit on the bottom, but of course when it's on you, the beads are going to distribute a bit. So it does have some weight to it because that's the point of a weighted blanket. So hopefully you learned how to make a weighted blanket today. Don't forget, I just want to say, in these times, I know a lot of people have anxiety for lots of different reasons. If I can help at least one person to create something that's going to soothe them and make them feel better, this entire thing is worth it. Everything I do is worth it. So take care of yourself, look out for others, and just be kind. Thank you. Don't forget to like this video, follow my YouTube, as well as Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, my Facebook group, Quite Nerdy Quilters, and don't forget about Twitch, where you can join and interact as I stream live.